Okay, one of the books I've enjoyed reading most over the last few years is a book by Susan Neiman, who's just about to speak. It's called Evil in Modern Thought, An Alternative History of Philosophy. And one of the key events in there was the Lisbon earthquake of November the 1st, 1755. And I just have a little brief comment to make about that before she starts, because the earthquake actually shocked everybody. It was inspired Voltaire, Kant, and Rousseau to furiously scribbling. The King of France promised to give up his mistress. All sorts of attempts were made to propitiate the demon of earthquakes. And the English people grew so good, according to Horace Walpole, that nobody makes a suit now but of sackcloth turned up with ashes. So they were frightened. And they thought God was angry. But if you look at the issue of Science, Volume 305, 27 August 2004, there's a very nice paper in there which explains exactly what caused the Great Lisbon earthquake. And I think that's one of the things that we've been talking about today, is how to replace the lack of knowledge about certain things, which lead us to take certain positions, with information that allows us to shift up and improve our take on what is actually going on. So Susan is currently at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. She's actually the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. And her new book that she's working on is Moral Clarity, a Guide for Grown-Up Idealists, which is described as a defense, I hope this is correct, a defense of the moral language of the Enlightenment as a foundation for a liberal worldview robust enough to meet contemporary challenges.
Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome.
All completely correct. I did want to say a couple of words about the discussion yesterday, and to some extent today, before I go into the two questions that Roger asked me to answer, having to do with morality without religion or with religion, or what one does instead or in addition, I cannot help but feel a real sense of foreboding in this conference that I didn't expect to find, although I've learned quite a lot. One of the most shocking statements that I've heard in the last couple of days was that of Stephen Weinberg, that the crazy old aunt of religion is on her last legs and we might miss her when she goes. Now, for an extremely distinguished scientist who values statements based on evidence and not on wishful thinking, I had to wonder where he was getting his information, because although this might have been a statement you would make 25 years ago, it's certainly not a statement that makes any sense now, when we all know the rise in religion, and not just in religious participation, but fundamentalist religion, is the most interesting and surprising fact of the last, let's say, decade at the least. Now, it seems to me we have two choices. We can pull up the barricades, see ourselves as the Irish monks in the 6th century holding out the bits of treasures of civilization and wisdom in front of the barbarians, and occasionally shout beyond the walls as to, for the couple of people that might still be around to listen. Or we can do something quite different, which is to ask ourselves what it is that they're seeing that we're not, what it is that's missing in our culture that they're getting from somewhere else. This is not simply a tactical consideration, although it is also a tactical consideration. Conferences like these and with this sort of subject are called because I think there's a perceived sense of crisis, and it's an international one. But I'm a bit reminded here of a conference on similar issues that was called about 10 days before the 2004 election in New York City. I know Richard Dawkins was there. Nobody else in this. Were you there? Sorry, forgot. And the conference was titled Us Versus Them. Now, there's the sort of interesting spectacle of the idea that a bunch of intellectuals sitting in New York could somehow, in a last-minute action, influence the tide of the election that everybody was frightened to. But we all came from various places and were committed to trying to do so. But as I sat there watching people preaching to the converted with rather lack of understanding of what was going on in the rest of the world, I walked out and said, boy, if this is us, they're going to win. So it's partly a tactical question, but I don't believe that we can change our tactics unless we genuinely change our attitudes. Richard Dawkins is staring skeptically. Yes, I do mean, no, he does not say, I haven't said anything that'll offend you yet, because I'm about to, namely, I do think that what's going on in the world needs to be treated with at least the respect that's necessary in order to get some more understanding, and that is what I'm trying to do in the book that I'm currently working on. So in order to answer the first question Roger asked, can we be good without God? I want to start with a biblical reference, enough to provoke some of you, I'm sure, and not just any old biblical reference, but one from a place dear to the hearts of fundamentalists, namely the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Just about everybody knows that the cities were destroyed completely. Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt for even looking at them backwards. The sin that did them in, by the way, is something you don't need to be a believer to abhor. We're not talking about fornication or multiple orgies here, but about the Sodomites' demand to drag out and gang rape two strange visitors to whom Lot gave shelter. The strangers turned out to be angels, which is the Sodomites' undoing, but their transgressions were pretty severe, even if you believe neither in God or the ancient rites of the guests. Now, what fundamentalists rarely tell you is what happens when Abraham goes to these dens of iniquity or stands before them and has his finest hour. God reveals his plan to annihilate the two cities, and Abraham speaks up. What if there are 50 innocent people among the sinners? The judge of all the earth, he says, cannot act so unjustly as to let the innocent and guilty suffer alike. Well, the judge of all the earth agrees. If there are 50 righteous people in Sodom, he will leave the city alone. And then Abraham answers, well, surely the Lord isn't a pedant, right? What if the number turns out to be smaller? Would he destroy the whole city for a lack of a mere 5? The answer is obvious. The Lord will save Sodom if there are 45 righteous people in it. And Abraham quits after bargaining God down to 10. Two things about his behavior stir hearts like mine. One is its resolute universalism. Abraham's concern for the innocence of Sodom has nothing to do with kinship or tribalism. It's concern for innocence everywhere. The other is Abraham's resoluteness, period. In his concern for the innocent, he's prepared to take risks, for the texts make it perfectly clear that Abraham is scared. His words are neither proud nor wheedling, but the plea of a servant towards a master who could extinguish him with a glance. Here I venture to speak to my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes, is what he says when he gets the negotiation going. Oh, let the Lord not be angry if I go on, is what precedes the line that bargains down to 30. Now, it's striking that Abraham seems more frightened when he pleads for the unknown Sodomites than when he prepares to follow the Lord's command to kill his own son. This text is likely to be more familiar, and the binding of Isaac is the thing that sustains fundamentalists of every color. When a voice calls you to take your son, your only son whom you love, and journey to a distant height which will be indicated later, you saddle up your ass and do it, secure in the faith that the Lord will solve whatever problems arise on the way. And however long Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theologians struggle to find multiple meanings in this text, the dominant seems to be this one. Abraham's unquestioning willingness to heed God's command to sacrifice the thing he loved most is what qualified him to become the father of what are called still the Abrahamic faiths. Kant's comment on the passage, by the way, was unequivocal. Abraham should have reflected and considered that whoever could ask him to do that can't be God. Now, I have no qualms about being partisan. The Abraham who risks God's wrath to argue for the lives of unknown innocents is the kind of man who would face down an unjust tyrant anywhere. He's deeply human in the best of all senses, and neither his fear nor his frailty stands in the way of his own reason. He's reverent but not deferential, for his faith is based on his moral backbone, not the other way around. He is, in short, what I like to call an Enlightenment hero. As Kierkegaard taught us, the Abraham who takes his son to Mount Moriah left ethics and enlightenment behind. But I'd be cheating if I tried to argue that the Abraham at Sodom and Gomorrah was the genuine or the more central one. I bring these two stories up to show that the Old Testament itself is magnificently equivocal. Both stories are part of our repertoire, anchored very firmly in the first book of the Bible on which so many others in all three faiths depend. And though religious thinkers will fight fiercely to show its standpoint to be the one religion really sanctions, each religion has signposts pointing both ways. On the one hand, towards a fundamentalist authoritarian strain that insists if you want to be faithful, you have to crucify your intellect, that is, to believe just because your belief is absurd. And on the other hand, each of the three Western religions has a rationalist tradition which begins from the recognition that no law applies itself, ever. Supposing you take revelation as authoritative, it still has to be interpreted. And most of what we know today as scholarship began in the attempt to figure out how law, which meant religious law at the time, applies to the world. So far from viewing our capacity to reason as threatening our capacity to obey God, this tradition sees thinking as its very fulfillment. There are actually some wonderful Jewish parables which show God laughing with pleasure as human beings defeat him with a particularly good argument. That is, God would rather be impressed than right on certain Jewish rationalist traditions. So, if reason is God's gift, he meant us to use it even against him if he turns out to be wrong or hasty. On this tradition, our ability to make sense of the world, whether with science or through the right moral actions, is just one more proof of God's goodness. Now, remembering these facts should stop us from dividing the world along religious and secular lines. I can't repeat this often enough. The question is not whether religion and science are compatible, but this is not the interesting divide. I don't want to go into this for too much time, but if you're curious about that, think about whether postmodernism and natural science are compatible. Whether they rest on the same notions of truth or evidence. I think the answer is really very clearly no. For many rationalist religious thinkers, there's more in common with secular social democrats than with fellow believers. And again, I think many a fideist is much closer to a postmodern nihilist than either wants to admit. Far less important than your belief whether God exists is what you think your belief entails. Does it direct your behavior by rules and commandments that are set out before you, or does it require you to think them through yourself? Does it require you to try to make sense of the world, or does it give up on sense itself? And I think these are the crucial distinctions, not whether you add belief in a God to them. So even for those who believe it, biblical authority doesn't help much. They have to decide how the book should be read, and any serious reading of it will raise the question, are things good because God loves them, or does God love them because they're good? And as Steve pointed out, readers of Plato will remember this isn't even a question that's confined to monotheism. All right, Socrates was executed for alleged impiety. His crime wasn't atheism. He really did believe in the local gods, but for insisting that reason take priority over them. Goodness isn't arbitrary. Things must be good in themselves, which is what makes the gods love them. The gods' choice cannot make something good that's evil, even if they happen to be gods. Now, for fundamentalists, this sort of view not only expresses pride, but it's the first step down a path which God himself, if subject to any limits, including the limits of reason, is no longer God, hence no longer necessary. There are very interesting arguments about this. I mean, the one thing I really do have to emphasize, one hears some rather, some of the objections to religious thinking that I've heard during this conference really does proceed on the assumption that there haven't been religious thinkers. And honestly, there have been. And they think about these things. And even if you don't believe in the existential claims that are being made, it's really interesting material. But I don't want to get into theological debates right now. I bring these stories up to show that whatever the tradition, there are deep sources for rejecting the question, do we need religion to maintain ethics? Because the answer is a resounding no. The Abraham of Sodom and Gomorrah certainly didn't. It was he who gave God lessons in ethics at extreme peril. And this story is at the very beginning of monotheistic traditions. Any ethics that needs religion is bad ethics, and any religion that tries to do so is bad religion. Of course, there are plenty of both around. This is a practical question. It needs to be dealt with practically. But first, we should be clear that neither genuine religious nor genuine moral impulses will ever be expressed in views that tie the two essentially together. If you view religion as necessary for ethics, you've reduced us to the ethical level of 4-year-olds. If you follow these commandments, you'll go to heaven. If you don't, you'll burn in hell, is just a spectacular version of the carrots and sticks with which you raise your children. If you clean up your room, you'll get the cookie, and if you don't, you have to stay inside. Those of us who raise them know that however often we rely on bribes and threats, reluctantly, the ethical behavior we want to instill involves getting beyond bribes and threats. That is, we want to prepare our kids to be responsible and generous and straightforward, even when the rewards aren't forthcoming, as they often aren't, of course, in the real world. Serious believers, on the other hand, loathe the sort of faith that springs up in foxholes. The religious feeling they cherish cannot pertain to a being who can be bribed. I'll do whatever you say if only, please, you'll save me. They hold this attitude to be no better than that of a pagan who thinks the gods will protect him if he cooks a particularly tasty bit of entrail. True faith, they think, is not a matter of bargaining, but of gratitude for creation. Now, if you hold religion seriously understood and ethics seriously understood to be separate, you have to believe that things are good or evil independently of the sanction of divine authority. Does that mean that you believe that there's an otherworldly standard of goodness fixed and eternal in a transcendent world? Well, Plato sort of thought so, and sometimes paints a picture so fairy tale-ish that it's provided fuel for centuries of postmodernists ever since. Postmodernists avant la lettre, nobody ever liked the thought of the ideas up there in the heavens beaming down the truths at the shadows below. I mean, this was really a serious view. But then the question becomes, are there moral laws that bind everyone, wherever they come from, whatever they believe? The greatest philosopher of modern times walked up to this question and turned sideways, refusing to answer directly. Instead, Immanuel Kant reached for a parable. Imagine, he says, a man who claims temptation overwhelms him whenever he passes what the 18th century discreetly referred to as a certain house. No matter what he tells himself beforehand, when he reaches the whorehouse, he has to go in. No tie of love, no fear of disease or shame is stronger than the claims of the flesh. Can we understand him? Well, easily, says Kant. But what if a gallows were installed before the whorehouse on which he'll be hung immediately after emerging from its depths? Suddenly he discovers he can withstand temptation very nicely, thank you. For however bright ordinary desires may be for sex or wealth or any other form of mortal pleasure, all of them pale before the desire for life itself. No life, no consumption. All of the sweets of the world put together cannot weigh against that. Now, let the same man be summoned before an unjust tyrant and given a choice. The ruler intends to execute an innocent subject fallen afoul of his regime, but the semblance of law demands an appearance of just procedures. Our roué is asked to write a letter denouncing the innocent. Should he refuse, the ruler will make sure he's executed himself. Now, as in the first case, Kant thinks it's easy to imagine being in this fellow's shoes. But unlike the first case, we suddenly waver. We do not know what we would do. Now, Kant always emphasized the limits of knowledge, and one of the things we never know for certain is the inside of our souls. None of us is so righteous as to be sure not to crumble in the face of death or torture. Most of us probably would. But all of us know what we should do, namely, refuse to write the letter, though it cost our own lives. And all of us know that we could do just that, whether or not we would totter in the end. In this moment, Kant says, we know our own freedom in a breath of awe and wonder. Not pleasure, but justice can move human beings to deeds that overcome the strongest of animal desires, the love of life itself. And contemplating this is as dizzy as contemplating the heavens above us. With this kind of power, we're as infinite as they are. Kant says this sort of example is simple enough to be grasped by businessmen, women, and 10-year-old schoolboys. Change the terms as you want, he seems to be right. It's a thought experiment nearly anyone can make, and the answers are surprisingly similar. You may want to vary the example. Writing letters is easy, so easy, in fact, that desk murderer, Schreibtischmörder, became the German word for Nazi bureaucrats like Adolf Eichmann. Putting marks on paper is so removed from the violence that takes life that many people who can swallow their qualms about one couldn't go through with the other. When I taught this example at a Yale ethics course, one student insisted he knew perfectly well what he'd do. He was a coward, he wanted to live, and he would sign any number of unjust letters in order to do so. Indeed, he claimed he would do anything, so we fenced for a while until I upped the ante. Was he certain he could kill children to save his own life? With machine guns? Well, what about with machetes? At that point he wavered. We know it's happened. Perhaps the most awful reports from contemporary Third World Wars are those describing children who were given the choice to hack up other children or be destroyed themselves, and some of them didn't do it. Now, what's the point of this example? It's the only answer the leading modern philosopher ever gave to the leading moral question philosophers are routinely asked. Is anything ever absolutely right or absolutely wrong, and if so, how would I know it? Kant offers the example at a crucial juncture in his Critique of Practical Reason, just when readers hope he's about to show them that the moral law is absolutely true. Those hopes are disappointed. For moral principles are never true. Truth is a matter of the way the world is. Morality is a matter of the way the world ought to be. The distinction between is and ought is the most important one we ever draw. It structures our experience in ways even deeper than the way experience comes structured into causes and effects. If morality is never a matter of fact, trying to convince moral skeptics with objective proofs is worse than senseless. Nor should we be urged to live rightly because it's in our self-interest to do so. Such arguments leave us helpless. Thanks. Have you been hearing me all this time?
Start again.
No. So this is about the identity of morality and self-interest. These are arguments which leave us helpless whenever morality and self-interest part company. In the times when they don't, we run on self-interest and don't need morality to move us. To pat Churchland's remarks on the subject, of course, lots of what we do morally is internalized. We don't consciously run through the categorical imperative when we tell somebody to get out of the way of a grizzly bear, or any host of small moral decisions, even, often rather large moral decisions that we make in the course of a week. Much of moral behavior is often in our and everybody else's interest, and we're either hardwired or socialized to do the right thing often, or both. I mean, hopefully we're both hardwired and socialized to do the right thing, okay? But I think it's a mistake to confuse the motive of our doing something with the justification of it, precisely because there are times when self-interest and morality do part company, but perhaps this is something we can take up in the discussion. To answer very briefly Roger's second question, whether there can be a science of morality, there can't be, because science is relentlessly about the is. I think this makes many great things, the humanities among them, not sciences, by the way. My German colleagues disagree about this so deeply that we can barely speak to each other about it, not because of the discussion becomes rancorous, but because of the inability to understand each other. I mean, for Germans, the humanities are so deeply sciences that you can't even call that into question. So I think science is a wonderful thing. I think it's one of the wonderful things in the world that human beings have created, and I don't think it's better or worse than the arts or the humanities, just as a side remark. So saying that morality isn't a science doesn't seem to me to demote it at all. That would be scientism. The idea that science is about description or the way the world is, and morality about the way the world ought to be, is so old and so easy to repeat that saying it can't add anything new to the discussion. I think the question really being asked, therefore, is how can we make people better if we can't convince them that it's good to do so in scientific ways, the way that we convince them that a new planet has been found or demoted or whatever it is that seem to clearly are clearer methods of persuasion. How do you answer the skeptic who wonders why he should be moral? Kant, known for abstraction, I think falsely known for an overemphasis on abstraction, actually says you do it by talking about heroes, people who risk their lives rather than resign themselves to injustice. We'll never know whether any person in particular, in history or fiction, really acted from pure love of justice, and deflating other people's heroes is easy enough. But when we engage in such discussions, each of us will imagine one person, at least, whom we believe defied death to do what was right. For that one, we will reject every attempt to trivialize her motives as resentful or petty. Such examples, as in Kant's gallows example, provide a glimpse of human dignity nothing else can replace, and lift us out of the world of sense into realms more exalted. I'm sure this kind of rhetoric will make people nervous, and because I'm trying to keep my discussion short, I'm not going to do anything right now to make you less nervous about it, except to suggest that for a start, we're not going to make any progress against the fundamentalists in religion unless we understand that one of the things being sought there is a conception of human dignity, not of debasement and not of passivity, that secular Western culture is not providing at the moment. Part of my new book, Moral Clarity, is trying to work out an image of what I've called an Enlightenment hero, precisely to undermine certain notions of false heroism, including religious terrorism, by arguing that it's less a matter of a search for rules than a search for dignity. But perhaps we can leave that as a question for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Susan. I think there might be some takers on your notion that there can't be a science of morality. Not on the grounds that it would demote it, but that it would just unnecessarily retard it. Let's see if we can find anybody who wishes to address those issues. Paul? I'll have to speak up then, won't I? Paul Churchland.
Thank you. I've been fingered, I must tell you, by our mutual friend here. And I've been fingered because he thinks I think that there can be a moral science, and he's hoping I'll say something here. So let me say something, and then you can tell me what you think is wrong with it. Okay. One possible take on human morality.
There's a hole here. Just sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
That's okay. One possible take is that, at least amongst advanced cultures, the prevailing moral orthodoxy, and that will include the political orthodoxy and rules for treating friends and raising children and so forth, is in fact the reflection of a long period of experimentation, social experiment. We live lives under a family of laws or rules or customs, and sometimes the shoe pinches, sometimes the wheels fall off, and our judges change the way they interpret the law, or our legislatures change the law or add to it. And if you've got a process that goes on long enough in this vein, you end up with a system of guidelines, economic, political, correctional, that guide the society's way of life in progressively more well-informed ways. That is to say, we make moral progress at all of these levels. And it is a learning process. It's driven by experiment, sometimes painful experiments, over long periods of time. And when you look at things from this point of view, the slow advance or evolution of morality doesn't look so different from the slow advance or evolution of scientific knowledge. And it's just as much to be prized.
Well, you'll be surprised that I actually agree with you, and I'm delighted to hear somebody make the claim that there is moral progress, because it's such a it can be such an incendiary thing to say, and it's a claim that I make myself and deeply believe in. But I don't think we make it as a matter of experiment. And take a couple of examples that I think are cases of serious moral progress in recent, historically seeing really quite recent times. The abolition of slavery was an absolutely major step, all right? And it's recent enough for us to have a fairly strong sense of what was meant there. I think you would actually find something close to universal consensus that humankind stepped forward when we decided to abolish slavery, even though, we've come up with other forms of exploitation, but that there was a major step made and in a direction that we think we ought to continue to go. What sort of experiment got made there to suggest that human beings have equal rights and that entails that you can't enslave some of them? I just, the notion of experiment there falls away, it seems to me. That's one example. So you set them free, and then you realize, gosh, they're not property. They're people with souls like me. However you parse the notion of
No. The
soul.
experiment took place before, and we discovered that we came to see, or people outside came to see, that slaves were living in misery. They weren't having the joys of raising their own children to maturity. There were conflicts between the slave owners and the slaves. There was a segment of humanity that was denied a whole range of possible kinds of flourishing. And this sort of realization has come sooner or later to almost every civilization, even going back to ancient Greece and Rome, that this isn't worth it. The advances you gain. And so we change our customs.
But you had, I'm not sure how important the disagreement between us is, but let me just make two further comments. You had in the American South a very serious body of literature and of people making speeches and discussing to the order that the Southern system was the more moral one. It was the more genuinely humane one. That the Northern form of exploitation was in fact much more brutal and caused much more pain and suffering than Southern slavery. And the studies that I've read on the subject are really quite equivocal. That is, it seems very hard to weigh the suffering caused by leaving people homeless and working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and living in horrid conditions and so on, and having no one care for them in sickness and old age. It's hard to weigh that with the fundamental indignity of being someone else's property and knowing that even if they treat you reasonably well, it's contingent and you belong to them. I mean, those are two quite different values. And at a certain point, it was said, look, what we value is actually this innate human dignity that's violated by the notion of slavery. So I'm not sure that this was something that people came to see. Just one other point, which I think is extremely important today about the notion of moral progress. One of the great moral advances of the Enlightenment was abolishing torture. And it's interesting to think about how far we've come when we think about the fact that 300 years ago, in virtually every square of every civilized city, certainly in Europe, torturing people to death was something not just that took place, but that you would have taken your children to go and see on a Saturday afternoon, right? I mean, that's what was happening. Now, the question is, what did people learn empirically when they decided, oh gosh, drawing and quartering actually causes too much suffering? I think we'll, put it out. I mean, I don't think that there's a fact that changed there that somebody had to realize. I think the example, by the way, is particularly important because while it shows that there can be moral progress, it shows that it's absolutely not necessary, and there can also be moral regression, as in the case of the current administration. But I don't see that what's taking place somehow when Bush decides to legalize torture and thereby cancel one of the major achievements of the Enlightenment. I don't see, he had, right? I mean, many achievements of the Enlightenment, but that one in particular. I don't see that what's happened is that there's something that he doesn't know that he could somehow be tutored on.
That's such a good answer. I have to give the microphone.
Jim Woodward over there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
No, but we can, but it won't go on tape. That's the issue. That's the limiting factor here.
Well, I wanted to just say a couple of quick things about this issue of the role of empirical information in moral thinking and reasoning and so on. And first of all, to support what Paul just said, I think the example of torture is a really interesting one because it seems to me that there was real moral learning and learning about, in the context of learning about empirical facts going on in the events that led up to the abolition of torture. So, for example, people learned that torture simply didn't work very well in providing, getting the kinds of information that they hoped to get from it. They learned something, again, that the current administration doesn't seem to understand, that you can't sort of localize torture if you try to, set up a system in which torture is allowed only in very specified circumstances. It tends to sort of get out and infect everything, and it attracts people with the worst sort of motivations and so on and so forth. And I think that if you go back and look at the historical record, you'll see those arguments of that empirical sort being made. In fact, those arguments are being made today by people who are opposed to the kind of torture practices that our government is engaged in. So that's just specifically on the question of torture. And then more generally, let me suggest one way in which, somewhat different way in which empirical information can be relevant to moral theorizing. And this is that we may learn, different moral theories, it seems to me, rest on various ideas about human motivation and what sorts of motives are at least sufficiently frequently available to us that they can motivate significant numbers of people to action. And it seems to me if you learn as an empirical matter that some motivation that you thought was common and easily relied on is very uncommon and not so readily relied on or available, that has a bearing on a normative theory. So a theory, for example, that requires that we be unconditional altruists, it seems to me, is hostage to the whole question of whether actual human beings behave in that way. So what I'm suggesting is that empirical information about motivation can act as it can help sort of constrain the space of possible moral theories, even though you don't get in that anything like a derivation of an ought from an is.
That's perfectly fine with me. And just, on a personal note, I was trained as a philosopher, but I run an interdisciplinary institute so that I get to learn empirical things sometimes from other people. I'm the last person who thinks that empirical information isn't relevant. On the contrary, I think philosophers, should work with more of it. So, of course, empirical information is relevant to moral theory. I'm just arguing that it's not determinant. And again, the torture case is. It's in a certain sense, it's a beautiful example of the way in the real world self-interest and moral interest do often work together. That is, it turns out to be the case that torture is not very effective. And so if you're dealing with someone who has no moral qualms whatsoever, like Donald Rumsfeld, it might be worth pointing out that, it's not in his interest to continue a policy that's simply feeding us false information. We're somebody where that the moral, whatever part of the brain deals with moral reactions, they're defunct in that, in some point. But it's a good thing that we've found that out. It's a bit of argument that we can use to make abolishing torture more appealing to people. But supposing it did, the whole point is, you're talking about two very, very different levels of objection, right? Supposing it were true that every time you tortured someone, they actually revealed what you couldn't get revealed in some other way, would you then continue torturing? Because one of the problems with those arguments is that someone like Rumsfeld or whomever will be able to come up with a case of somebody who was tortured and did reveal something that intelligence wanted to know. There'll be 70 other cases in which it didn't, but they'll be able to come up with one case, and then what do you say? Well, it's all right?
Scott Atran, you've been waiting to ask a question.
Yes. Except for the gratuitous remark about Rumsfeld, I found this talk to be one of the most enlightening, a sort of little flicker as I watch this audience drive like blind car racers off a cliff. I think in science there is progress. This is the case, and postmodernism may doubt it, but I think it's wrong. But in politics and ethics, not in the cases of the grizzly bear, but in the politics and ethics and history, progress is, if anything, fitful, and it's reversible. As Menachem Begin once said, civilization is intermittent. And liberty and freedom are recurrently won and lost in alternating cycles of war and violence, and there's no evidence whatsoever that that is changing one iota. And I don't see although there may be in some ideal world the possibility of a scientific moral ethics, I certainly don't see in this audience the slightest indication that people here are emotionally or intellectually equipped to deal with the facts of changing human knowledge in the context of unchanging human needs that haven't changed much since the Pleistocene. And I don't see there's any evidence that science is being used to try to understand the people you are trying to convince to join you. So, for example, the statements we've heard here about Islam in this audience are worse than any comic book statement that I have heard about it, and make the classic comic books look like the Encyclopedia Britannica compared to what we've been hearing here. Statements about who the jihadis are, who a suicide bomber is, what a religious experience is, except for one person. You haven't the slightest idea. You haven't produced one single fact. You haven't produced one single bit of knowledge. Not a single bit. Every case provided here is an N of 1, our own intuition, or one's self-intuition, except for Rama, who had an N of 2, one brain patient. Okay? Luckily, we had some diversity. And from there, generalizations are made about religion, about what to do about religion, about how science is to engage or not engage religion, about what is rubbish and what is not. It strikes me that if you ever really want to be serious and you want to engage the public to make it a more peaceful and compassionate world, you've got to get real. You've got to get some data. You've got to get some knowledge. And you can't trust your own intuitions about how the world is. Be scientists. There is no indication whatsoever that anything we've heard about other people shows any evidence of scientific inquiry.
Would anybody like to respond to that? We actually, let me just say that there was a suggestion there that we need to deal with religion. We actually do have Loyal Rue here who can put us on straight and narrow on that for a moment. And then we have Mazrin Banaji and Beth Loftus here, who I think could inject, I hope, some response to what Scott just said. So perhaps the easiest thing to do would be, instead of starting a debate on that, given the time, is to move on to Loyal and then have those two talks. Is that okay? Sure.
Well, I don't know about the straight and narrow part of it.
All right. The twisty.
I'm glad to be here. I think it's pretty clear, I think, to all of us now that...
No, I forgot to mention Loyal Rue is at Luther College and is Professor of Theology and History of Religion, and is a two-time Templeton Award winner. So.
It's actually philosophy and religion, yeah. Well, it's pretty clear, I think, to all of us that the issues we're dealing with here are complex. We've heard lots of different voices. And the issues are also consequential. There's a lot at stake. And so I want to help us try to get at, we've heard some about the religious mind or religious mentality, and I'd like to help us try to get to one way of thinking about the nature of religion, because I think that's an important thing to sort out. First, let me just indicate that I think it's possible to both generalize and naturalize religion. There's a view out there, sort of postmodernist notion, that it's impossible to generalize across cultures, that every culture is sui generis, that there is no commensurability between cultures, and I think that's probably wrong, and I think we can, in fact, seek out some cultural universals and come up with a general theory of religion. There's another widespread notion out there that suggests that you cannot naturalize religion, and this is, I think, in part due to the influence of a great historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, who said that religion is really about the sacred, and since the sacred cannot be naturalized, you cannot naturalize religion. Well, I don't think religion is about the sacred, actually. I think we can make a distinction between the goal of religion, the motives of religion, and the function of religion. Those are all teleological notions, but I think the goal of religion is one thing. When I was a kid, growing up, like everyone else, I assumed that religion was about God, and that the goal of religion was to come into some sort of relationship with God. And I think for most devout people, that is what religion is about. That's the goal of religion. The more I looked at religion and religious behavior, the more I could see that beneath the goal of religion, there were motives at work in religion, and I saw that these motives were primarily therapeutic and political. So I got thinking religion may be on the surface about God, but if you dig down a little bit, it's really about therapy and politics. That is, it's about personal wholeness, and it's about social coherence. And so if those are the motives of religion, I looked at that very carefully, and the more I looked at these motives of religion, the more I saw a biological function, which happens to be reproductive fitness. Now, I think that's pretty reductionistic, and if that's the case, then I can try to defend that later on. But anyway, what I want to suggest, so we have those differences between the end or the goal, the motives, and the function. I think we can understand religion if we can sort out the structure of a religious tradition. I think there is an underlying structure behind all religious traditions, and I think we can sort out the functions that religion performs, and I think we can say something about the origins. So if we understand the structure, the functions, and the origins of religion, I think we have a good understanding of what religion is. I can't say much about the origins today, but I think I'll try to say something about the structure and the function. In my view, all religious traditions are narrative traditions. They have at the core, at the center, way down deep, a myth, a story. And it's not just any old kind of story. It's a special kind of story. Is that me fading away, or is that something else? It's a story. The myth, the central story, really brings together and integrates two different kinds of ideas. Every religious tradition has cosmological ideas, that is, ideas about how things are ultimately in the world, and every religious tradition has moral ideas, that is, ideas about which things matter ultimately for human fulfillment. Now, religious traditions bring these together in a centralized, integrated myth. That is to say, ideas about how things are brought together and confused with ideas about which things matter. And I think this is what's unique about the religious mentality, that facts and values are confused. And this is important because it provides the religious perspective with a cosmos that is infused with value, and it also provides us with values that have some sort of cosmic endorsement. If they have cosmic endorsement, then they will work in our minds with the same kind of authority that facts have in our minds. And so it's important for religious traditions to bring together ideas about how things are ultimately with ideas about which things matter ultimately. Now, obviously, that's a violation of the naturalistic fallacy. I think religious traditions systematically violate the naturalistic fallacy by confusing facts and values. But I think actually the human brain also does that. I think the human brain is a naturalistic fallacy violating system. I mean, think about it. Every good brain has to do three things. It has to sort of figure out what's going on in the world around and somehow encode information about the world around. A good brain also has to map what's going on in the world within. That's the sort of biological value system inside. And a good brain has to bring those two together so that it can invent some sort of adaptive behavior. And so all I'm suggesting here is that a myth, in a way, does this sort of function on a sort of cultural level. It brings together facts and values. Which suggests then that the central myth of a culture, and this is I don't think you can overemphasize this, the central myth of a cultural tradition provides us with a single vocabulary, okay, a unified vocabulary that gives us an ultimate explanation for all facts. At the same time, it gives us an ultimate justification for all values. A single vocabulary that justifies values and explains facts. Now, how does that happen? I think it happens. I mean, what can bring these, link these two together? I think in religious traditions, what does that for us is metaphor. We have these metaphors that can somehow integrate facts and values. Now, the metaphor in the Abrahamic traditions, that is the dominant metaphor, is the metaphor of God as person, the personal God. This brings together facts and values. It provides the ultimate explanation for facts, the ultimate justification for values, because, in fact, God is the creator of the world, creator of all reality, and God is also the author of the moral order. One God creates both the world of facts and the world of values. So that one God functions then as the ultimate explanation for facts and the ultimate justification for values. This is in the Abrahamic traditions. Other traditions have other metaphors that work to provide the same function. In Indian traditions, the Dharma is that kind of metaphor. In Chinese tradition, the Tao. In ancient Greek tradition, the Logos. These are notions that integrate fact and value. Now, but that's not all there is to religion, because there are strategies. Once ideas are brought together into an integrated myth that brings together morality and cosmology, it's important for that story to get into the heads of everybody in the culture. We have to organize the stuff in here. And if my sort of organization of my consciousness is similar to the organization of your consciousness, then we have the resources for sharing a common culture. Okay, so it's important to get these brains organized in a similar way so that we will see the world in a similar way. We'll have a sort of intuitive understanding of what problems are and so on. We'll be on the same page, you might say. So it's important to get these ideas into people's heads. And so religious traditions have developed all these strategies for refreshing the story, for maintaining the story, revitalizing the story. And these strategies I've indicated here: intellectual, institutional, ritual, experiential, and aesthetic. Together, they constitute a kind of full court press on the consciousness, right? I mean, these strategies are constantly, it's like keeping a religious tradition together is like sweeping water into a pile. If you've never tried that, you should try it sometime. It takes a lot of work to keep a story alive. And this is what these strategies do. Religious traditions have intellectual strategies. That means they have philosophers or theologians or pundits that are on hand to clarify the myth, to interpret the myth, and also to defend the myth against criticism from the outside. There are institutional strategies. Somebody's got to decide when we're going to meet. Somebody's got to decide who gets to be a priest or a priestess. Somebody has to decide polity, internal polity for sorting out disagreements within the tradition, and so on. There is also the ritual dimension. Scott Atran is really good on this. If you want to hear more about that, you should ask Scott. Ritual tradition, ritual strategy brings people together so that they can watch each other's behavior in this communal setting. It's also the case that in ritual, when the story is sort of relived, the individual can map on his or her individual story to the cosmic story. Okay, I think this is partly what's going on in the Christian Mass. In the Mass, you have the death and resurrection of the Christ figure, and the individual can map onto that. Everybody here knows what death and resurrection is about. You've had setbacks, you've had losses, you've had to pick up the pieces, dust yourself off, and get going again. You've had to keep on going when things are rough. That's crucifixion and resurrection. And so when we go through the Mass, you can sort of see how that story is, in a way, my story. And ritual helps us to do that. There is also the aesthetic dimension of religious traditions. I think it's a really interesting story to look at early Christianity. Early Christianity never got itself going until it got its art. And so there has to be some sort of objective way, some sort of tangible stuff that gets out there that can excite the imagination of individuals, and so that they will take on the story. Then there is the experiential strategy. Every religious tradition that I know of recommends that individuals have some sort of religious experience. This makes a religious tradition empirical in a way. I mean, if you have a religious experience, that is a personal, direct validation of the story, and it will keep the story alive. It'll keep your head organized around the story. If you talk to God this morning and you come in and hear a demonstration that God doesn't exist, you wouldn't even hear that because you've had this direct experience. And so all these strategies are working together to not only help articulate the story, the central story, but to revitalize it, to keep it active, to transmit it from brain to brain, to keep ourselves organized around this story, so that, okay, now here comes the sort of political and psychological motives, so that we can achieve personal wholeness, that is personal fulfillment, and social coherence. Now, it's my view that we've got to achieve both of those things at the same time, and that's tough, because in a way they compete with each other. Individuals are in competition with society. I mean, everybody wants more from the group than they're entitled to, and the group, for its part, is always demanding more of the individual than the individual has to offer. So personal wholeness and social coherence, while they are mutually dependent, they're also in conflict with each other. And so this is difficult to achieve both of those simultaneously. But I think that's one of the things that stories, religious traditions do. They help us to achieve these things simultaneously. And now we come to the biological function. I think that our best chance as a species, okay, other species have different strategies, but our species, the name of the game in our species is achieve sociality and achieve personality. That is to say, if we can achieve personal wholeness and social coherence simultaneously, we thereby maximize our opportunities for reproductive fitness. So this is what story does for it. That's the way it's structured, and it functions to enhance personal creativity or personal wholeness and social coherence. Now, that is a sort of picture of the kind of religious tradition that has been inherited in the West. I mean, that's very familiar. A dualistic cosmology, right? There is nature, and then there is supernature, and the morality is always an anthropocentric morality. I'm going to speed by a little bit here and go to this question, because here I think we get some glimpse of what is really at stake. One of the things that I was thinking about yesterday was the very sort of obvious to me fact that Sam Harris and the Taliban are both scared of the same thing. Right? I mean, Sam Harris told us that, hey, we can lose it all, right? I mean, there's this recognition that our life together, our civilized order, is a fragile thing, and by God, we could lose it all. That's a real possibility. When we're threatened with that, we want to dig in our heels and worry about it. Well, anyway, here's a sort of typology of different forms of social organization. Anthropologists sometimes use a simple progressive story like this. Originally, of course, our species lived in familial bands, small groups. Actually, I don't think in these small groups there was anything resembling an articulate morality. I think what was going on in familial bands was intuitive morality, and nobody had a set of rules. I mean, if you got out of line, you got a bad look, or you got your face slapped, or something like that. I mean, it's sort of like families. When I'm at home with my family, everybody knows what the limits are. Everybody knows what they can and can't do without any articulate morality. It's only when we get to counterintuitively large social groups, right? I mean, at the level of familial bands, I think morality is pretty much ordained by our genetic inheritance. But when we get into tribal alliances, counterintuitively large social groups, then we need an articulate morality. And when we have an articulate morality, we have to have a story that will justify that morality. And so I think that's where religion originated, in that complex transition from familial bands to tribal alliances. There we got religion. And as we made transitions to more complicated, larger forms of social organization, we had to retell the story so that we could legitimate the instruments of power and the institutions and so on that exist at the higher levels. So as we made a transition from tribal alliances, which were pretty much egalitarian, pretty much sharing equally, when we made the transition from that to chiefdoms, where the chief owns everything and is not egalitarian, the chief sort of hands things out, we had to have a new story that would legitimate the role of the chieftain. And as we made a transition from chiefdom to nation state, we had to legitimate the bureaucracy on principles of rational principles of collective civil life. And so we had to have a new story to go along with the transition to the nation state. Now here's where I think things are getting really difficult. This is why I think our conversations here are so consequential. We're stuck really with a choice between transcending this insane notion of 182 or 181 sovereign, independent nation states. And we could, in fact, transcend that nation-state system to achieve a kind of global federation. Or we could default back to something a little bit less, perhaps even back to chiefdom. And if we default all the way back, we'll go back to family bands. Well, let's see. One of the things I want to say here is that whenever you get into one of these transition periods, you see sort of widespread, almost systematic breakdown of personal wholeness and social coherence. Things get really tough, and people start looking crazy, and social institutions begin to break down. That's a sort of edge of chaos effect, perhaps. But we have now the possibility of transcending this. How far do you think we're going to get into the 21st century if we have 181 sovereign states that refuse to cooperate in any meaningful way at all? So either we make that transition to a global federation, or else we default back. Okay, now I'm going to say something about, you're going to throw me out. No, okay.
Not exactly, but
all right.
the time is running out.
Right, okay.
Because we need to
Well,
get...
you wanted the straight and narrow, Roger. You're going to get it. Here is a possibility for a new story that could somehow be consistent with a global federation. Okay, now here I'm basically talking about the story that Carolyn Porco and Neil were working on yesterday. That blows me away, that story. I mean, it just knocks me off my pins. I mean, I've been watching Cosmos. I still watch Cosmos, by the way. Our library had to go and get those tapes, and it wears well, I have to say. This is a great story. It's not a story of, it's not a dualistic cosmology. It's a naturalistic evolutionary cosmology. And it looks to me like there's possibility for a new morality. And I think actually science can help us a lot here because it can inform us about these behavior mediation systems that we have inherited. We know that these behavior mediation systems can be manipulated by symbolic means, okay? So when we get some real pictures from Hubble or wherever to show us the sort of social or the global solidarity that we're capable of, I mean, that moves us. Anyway, what we need then is the articulation of this new story where we pin together a naturalistic evolutionary cosmology with a sustainable sort of trans-anthropocentric morality. And then we have to develop the intellectual, institution, ritual, and aesthetic and experiential strategies to help articulate that story, to transmit it from brain to brain, and to celebrate together. And that, I think, is an exciting prospect. It's going to look ugly in the short term. I mean, you've got two big cultures sort of clashing at each other. The whole world seems to be breaking down in terms of its social coherence. And also, individuals are breaking down in terms of their personal wholeness. But there is hope, I think, in the long term if we can articulate this new story. So I'll just leave it there. And I just want to thank Neil and Carolyn for telling that story. All right.
Great, thank you. Because of certain travel constraints, we really need to hear from Beth Loftus at this point, and then we'll go to lunch, and then we'll be hearing from Mazarine and Richard after lunch, so, and a group of other people. But let's at least hear from Beth Loftus to begin with. Now, do you have your movie to set up?
I think your people set it up. Thank you, Roger. I'm sorry that I have to, that I can't stick around tonight to continue some of the fun conversations from last night. I have to interview a job candidate and teach a class tomorrow. But I'm here. It's an odd kind of place for me to be. When I was a little girl, I remember my relatives telling me that God could see me no matter where I was, and knew where I was and knew what I was thinking. And I once hid behind the floor-to-ceiling curtains and asked my aunt, can he see me now? And she insisted he could. And then when I was 14 years old, my mother drowned in a swimming pool. And so I decided very early on there couldn't be a God. About 15 years later, my father was struggling with melanoma. He eventually died. But during that time, I turned to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, thinking I could get some relief in reading stories of people who were going through something similar. And I found that just about every person that she wrote about turned to God for relief. And so I envied them. I wished I could do that. It certainly seemed like it would be less unhealthy than turning to vodka, but it just wasn't my kind of relief. And so I grew up to be a psychological scientist who has spent 30 years studying how we plant false beliefs and false memories in the minds of people. And so I guess I keyed in on some things like, I guess it was only 24 hours ago or so, from the very first set of talks that we had, when we heard Steven Weinberg say that we need to wake up from the long nightmare of religious belief, and anything we can do as scientists to weaken the hold of these beliefs, we ought to be doing. And Sam Harris talked about religious maniacs and the responsibility of science to use that science to help correct dangerous beliefs. And so I thought, well, I know something about beliefs and memories. Maybe my science could be put to this use. I don't want to get rid of all beliefs. I want Joan to be able, when she's having personal difficulties, to turn to faith if she wants to do that. But I'd like to figure out a way to, and I haven't thought about this before, to put my science to use to getting rid of dangerous beliefs. There might be a lesson in another war that has occurred over the last 15 years where we have changed a lot of minds. I'm talking about 10 to 15 years ago where many psychotherapists believed that millions of people were harboring repressed memories of sexual brutalization. They were completely unaware of these experiences, and through a therapeutic process that might involve hypnosis or dream interpretation, guided imagery, they could lift the veil of repression, become aware of these experiences, and then be cured. And we saw thousands of individuals then coming up with these allegedly repressed memories, sometimes of years of brutalization. Sometimes these individuals develop memories of being forced into satanic rituals where they had to participate in animal sacrifice and baby breeding, baby sacrifice, the works. Sometimes they develop multiple personalities, and it got so that three, like 3 Faces of Eve, was not enough. You had to have 100 personalities or several hundred in order to be anybody. How did this happen? Well, the virus spread in the form of mental health professionals who started, primarily in North America, and then exported this, I don't know if you'd call it a meme or whatever, this set of ideas to Europe, especially Britain, to Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world, in the form of workshops and continuing education programs where the psychiatrists and psychologists who were participating in this activity would then teach others how to dig for allegedly repressed memories. And thousands of people then sued their parents and their former neighbors and their former teachers and anybody. Well, this isn't happening so much anymore in as short a period of time as 15 years. So what happened? How did we have such a sea change of attitude in such a short period of time? I'll tell you, and I don't know if this is the answer for the dangerous religious beliefs that are leading to evil behavior, but one ingredient, I think, has to do with litigation. A number of these individuals who got sucked into this process and began to believe that their parents had molested them, maybe they sued their parents or got them prosecuted, whatever, the families got destroyed, they started to realize that their memories were false. Now, how did that happen? From the point of view of a memory scientist, it's very interesting to me how someone sheds a belief that they've held for a year or 2 years or 5 years or whatever. For one thing, their insurance ran out, and so they no longer were able to afford the psychotherapy that was bolstering and propping up this belief system. And the group therapy that bathed them in a love bath for holding these beliefs about themselves as victims ended as well. And then these retractors turned around and sued their former therapists for planting false memories. A woman in Minnesota got $2.6 million against Dr. Humanansky. Several other of the patients of that particular psychiatrist also recovered large sums of money. A $10.6 million settlement against a psychiatrist in the hospital in Chicago, where responsibility was laid for making the woman think she was a multiple personality patient, and then working on her young children and making them believe that they had multiple personalities, requiring several years of psychiatric hospitalization. That's why that award was so big. So we don't see so much of this activity anymore. Insurance companies have explicitly said, if you do recovered memory therapy, we're not going to cover you. And so this idea has seemed to have faded away as the leaders of the movement, one by one, found themselves on the wrong side of a lawsuit by a retractor or a retractor's family who was badly harmed by these activities. Well, my own work in a related area has to do with planting false beliefs and false memories. And I spent 30 years or so getting people to believe all kinds of incredible things. I and other psychological scientists who work in this area have managed to convince people that they were lost for an extended period of time in a shopping mall as a child, that they were frightened and crying and ultimately rescued. Others have convinced people they had accidents at family weddings, or they were attacked by a vicious animal, or they had a serious indoor or outdoor accident. It's not that hard to plant false beliefs and false memories in the minds of people. And so maybe we could use some of this methodology that we've learned to get people to hold these beliefs and to act on them and put these ideas to use in correcting some beliefs that we might think are pretty dangerous, either taking beliefs away from people or inserting, new and useful and healthy beliefs. I had the pleasure of a visit by Alan Alda, who was doing a one-hour special on memory for Scientific American Frontiers. He hosts that program. He's a science buff. He loves his job now because he gets to go around the world, talk to scientists everywhere. And on this occasion, he came to the University of California, Irvine, and I tried to plant a false memory in his mind. And I want to, it's an 8-minute film. It'll teach you a little bit about the kind of methodology that we use. And maybe then I invite you to think about whether some of these strategies might be developed for solving some of the problems that we are talking about here today. Let's see, he taught me to press a button and something would happen.
A nice setting for lunch where the grad students...
We're still on the campus of the University of California, Irvine, where along with her students, Elizabeth Loftus has invited me to a picnic.
It's good.
Oh, this looks very good.
Yeah, have a seat.
Okay.
It's an appetizing spread, but among the choices, one leaps out at me immediately.
Deviled eggs. There are the deviled eggs.
Now, to understand why I'm so taken with those eggs, we have to go back a couple of weeks.
Can you pass a plate, Alan, please?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Hate watermelon.
Elizabeth had sent me a long questionnaire about the foods I like or dislike. Another questionnaire was about things that may or may not have happened to me as a child.
I ate 2 scoops of ice cream and 1 cone. That definitely did happen. Of course it happened. Sold chocolate bars for a fundraiser. Definitely did not happen. Ate freshly pickled vegetables. No. I'm, as you can imagine, fascinated to know what the questionnaire was really about. I mean, wasn't about food, was it?
Well, actually, we have a very sophisticated computer program that can take all of that information that you gave us about your childhood, about your, your likes, your dislikes, your habits, your personality. Yeah. We have fed it into a computer.
Right. And you can tell my shoe size from that.
My obvious skepticism here stems from knowing that Elizabeth is an expert on false memories, things we think we remember, but that never really happened.
This is the profile from this very, very sophisticated computer program, and so I'd just like you to take a look at it, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions about it.
Let's see. You disliked spinach as a young child. You enjoyed fried foods. You felt sick after eating hard-boiled eggs. Eating chocolate birthday cake made you happy. I can't remember any time when I ate chocolate birthday cake and actually got happy from it.
All right, well, let me just pick one of the other ones.
Okay.
You felt sick after eating hard-boiled eggs. Just
no.
When?
No, I can say with almost certain. You can't be certain about anything that happened that long ago, but I'm pretty sure that I never got sick after eating hard-boiled eggs. I can't remember a time when that might have happened.
Well, the thing about our childhood is that because it's so long ago, and because there is forgetting, and because there is childhood amnesia, and there are all kinds of things going on, we often don't remember things that are true of us. Right. I mean, you'd accept that, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you try to imagine what might have happened, it will tap into some of those forgotten experiences. So that's why I was asking you to try to think about when you might have eaten chocolate cake, or when you might have eaten too many hard-boiled eggs and not felt that great about it.
Yeah. Can't remember a time when I might have eaten hard-boiled eggs and gotten sick from it. Don't remember eating many hard-boiled eggs as a kid either. Water high.
A few minutes later, I'm again filling out the questionnaire about my childhood experiences with food.
Ate a hot dog with onions and sauerkraut. No. Ate a candy apple at a state fair. No. Got sick after eating too many hard-boiled eggs. No, but I can't be definitely sure. Say it too. Had a cheese pizza delivered. No. Tell me the truth. You don't even have a computer, do you?
We do. You saw some of our better computers in there, but we do.
I bet that's a trick. What do you suppose that is?
Well, of course there's a trick. Elizabeth was trying to persuade me I remembered something that hadn't happened.
Oh, really? Okay, Alan. Here was the study. A few weeks ago, we asked you about your childhood experiences and asked you if you ever felt ill eating hard-boiled eggs, and you said one definitely didn't happen.
Right.
Then we gave you feedback from a computer in which of course was bogus, right. And I know you maybe suspected that, but it was bogus. But in the middle of that feedback was from the very smart computer. We suggested that you as a child had gotten sick eating hard-boiled eggs. And later, when we asked you to fill out the sheet about your childhood again, you increased your confidence. You gave it a 2 this time instead of a 1, I believe. And so you did show an effect that we're showing in this study, that increased confidence that you had the experience that was suggested to you, but was completely made up by us. Now, the last step in this process is to see whether the manipulation has any further consequences down the road. I mean, will you avoid hard-boiled eggs?
I'm just not that interested in hard-boiled eggs.
Well, people make up all kinds of rationalizations for their behavior. I mean...
By claiming that a smart computer had insights into their childhood, Elizabeth Loftus has managed to persuade many of the subjects in her study to change their opinion about what foods they like or dislike. In other words, not only is it frighteningly easy to implant false memories in people, you can then get them to change what they think and maybe even how they behave based on those false memories.
It's more than potato chips that is at the heart of this somehow, right? I mean, a lot of your work has to do with false memories and court cases.
Right. Little tiny false memories, maybe, that we probably have all the time, don't hurt people very much. But when it comes to people developing these very big false memories of being molested in satanic rituals or assaulted by people who didn't do anything to them, and we know that false memories of this sort have been generated, then it does people a lot of harm. Wrong people get prosecuted, innocent people get sued civilly, and so the false memory problem is a very big problem in society, and we're here really just trying to understand how it is that you can plant a seed of suggestion, and out of this a whole false memory can grow.
Well, I intend to nip one false memory in the bud right now. Give me that egg. But I don't eat the yolks.
That's good.
Well, we've planted false memories probably in the minds of 25,000 subjects over the course of 30 years. This latest work that is actually kind of inspired by the whole repressed memory controversy that I lived through for the last 10 years is part of an effort, not only on my part, but others who work in this field, to plant really rich, big false memories, such as the ones that I mentioned to you, that you were victim of a vicious animal attack or a serious indoor or outdoor accident. And here we're looking at whether those false memories have repercussions, affect subsequent thoughts, intentions, and behaviors down the road. And so you can take people who will deny having an experience to begin with when they enter the study. You subject them to the manipulation. Later on, they will tell you they actually do have either a belief that this is true of them or a memory. That means it has sensory detail attached to it, and it feels like a real recollection. And so I guess I throw this out to you. Is there some possibility that this kind of approach to the problem of changing what people think and maybe correcting some of those dangerous beliefs is something that we ought to be looking into for purposes of the concerns that have brought us, many of us, here today. So thank you for listening, and Alan for helping me.
Actually, can I just ask you a quick question? I'm not sure. Did Alan get sick afterwards or anything?
Pardon?
He didn't get sick, though, did he?
No. In fact, he wasn't falling for this. He would not have, he did show increased confidence on this scale, but he never would have developed, if he'd been in the actual study, he wouldn't have said that he had a memory or belief. So he's in the 60% who aren't influenced.
Right. I think it's also important that when you, just let me make one point, which is when you said what happened and you talked about insurance companies and all sorts of things, I think you forgot to mention that you happened as well and that you played a huge role in this at great personal loss as well. I think you ought to be congratulated for what you did. So there was questions from Rama. Already has a mic, Terry.
Yeah, very elegant presentation. I do have a question. Like you study memory, I study perception and vision. And what strikes me about human memory, in addition to what you said about the fallibility, is how extraordinarily reliable it is. And if it had not been otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. It's astonishing how good our memory is. I can say the same thing about perception. I can produce illusions which violate common sense, and then you find out what causes the illusion. But this doesn't prove that vision is highly fallible. It proves under ordinary circumstances it's extremely good, but using contrived stimulus, I can produce an illusion which illuminates the mechanisms of perception. And would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, obviously memory serves us very well, and we wouldn't be able to get up in the morning and know where the bathroom was and how to make the coffee, and so the reading the paper and so on without it. And maybe it is that psychologists often like to focus on errors. They're kind of more interesting, but in my career, I study errors that are devastating for people because they're the reason we have 187 approximately DNA exonerations that are on the Innocence Project website, people who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't do. So, yeah, we probably shouldn't lose sight of the fact that memory often works well, but I think these errors are very important to be looking into. Just like planes fly, and most of them don't crash, but when one does, we study it to death.
So, you mentioned differences between people in their ability to be implanted or suggestibility. How does that vary with age?
Well, people have looked at individual differences in susceptibility to these kinds of influences. And you're asking about age. I mean, we do know that young children are more susceptible than older children and adults. Also, there is some evidence that the elderly are more susceptible. But those are the only age effects. The one individual difference variable that seems to correlate with susceptibility is, are you someone who has lapses in memory and attention? So are you someone who frequently can't remember, did I do that thing, or did I just think about doing it? I mean, I have that a lot with, at least once a week. I can't remember if I shut the garage, and so I go back, and I always have shut it, but I just have to do this. But fortunately, I live on campus, so I don't go out of my way too much. That could be a problem if you commute a long distance. But if you're somebody who has lapses in memory and attention, you're more susceptible. The correlations aren't, they're statistically significant, not great, on the order of 0.3, 0.32. And that's about the best we can find as an individual difference.
Do you find a correlation between susceptibility to implanted memory and whatever might be the index of measure for their capacity to believe without evidence? And I ask that because I don't see much of this in the New York market where I'm from, but when I travel across the country and then I channel surf the television, there's these no end of stations that have just sort of continuous coverage of preachers in very large venues repeating sort of the same message and the same idea in multiple ways persistently to an audience that is rapt by this that's going on. And I'm just curious, you were asking whether an implanted memory might serve some greater good. Is that easier or harder to implement than just simply telling someone the same message over and over and over? And if there's a sort of a gullibility factor, then that might be just all it takes to change someone's mind.
Right. Well, I don't know that because I don't know that anybody's looked at that. But your comment did make me want to mention that one of the people who was very active in the repressed memory business, supporting the, some of the accusers who'd come up with this satanic ritual abuse. I watched an awful, awful performance by him on Sally Jesse Raphael about 10 years ago, is today making people believe that they're possessed by the devil and they should pay him some money for exorcisms. And if we weren't being taped, I'd say his name, but I don't need another lawsuit.
So isn't there some work that shows that you can possibly distinguish a false memory from a real memory? Danny Schachter's work I'm thinking of.
I can speak to that.
And if somebody like Richard was in a Persinger setup, I mean, could they have told whether Richard was having a bogus experience or...
Well, Richard presented the data. He just happens to be in that one group that didn't. But he's not. We don't have to do a psychoanalysis of Richard.
No.
I mean,
we haven't the time for that.
Maybe for other reasons, but not because of that.
So, in other words, can one distinguish between
the neuroimaging of true and false memories?
Yes.
Well, interestingly, one of the first studies that looked at this was with relatively pallid materials. That is true and false memories for words that you had heard, and you need to use these simple materials because obviously you need lots of true memories and lots of false memories so that you can compare the neural signals. And although some time ago Schachter did report using PET that there were common areas that were activated, but also some dissimilar areas for the true and false memories. He took it back a few years later when he did fMRI, doing a similar kind of study. There are statistical differences between true and false memories, but there's so much overlap in the distribution that there is no way you're going to be able to take a single memory and reliably classify it as true or false, at least not for a long time.
You actually haven't spoken.
Can you talk about the relationship between the suggestibility and hypnotizability and dissociative symptoms?
One group found a correlation between susceptibility to these kinds of manipulations and your scores on the creative imagination scale, which is thought to be a measure of vividness of visual imagery and hypnotizability. And so there may be some relationship there with hypnotizability.
Katie, could you give?
Mark Levendale, researcher, Preventive Care Institute. One of the things that we work on is the study of migraine headaches. And there is significant double-blind studies in the literature, the Lancet, showing that migraine headaches are caused by a delayed type of allergic reaction to foods. And yet we're faced today with an medical industry that often has convinced their patients that their migraine headaches are caused by past life experiences. And so I commend you for the work that you've done, and much more needs to be done because this is still going on. It's still a great problem.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the past life because, you know, there is many masters, many lives or whatever. You know, there are the people out there, if you end up with a past life therapist, you end up with past lives. And if you end up with a satanic ritual abuse therapist, you end up, you know, with SRA memories. And if you end up, you know, with an alien abduction kind of person, you end up getting that set of beliefs reinforced. There's often some sort of kind of therapist or guru type figure that helps to facilitate and encourage and fuel these beliefs.
Okay, Bill? Yeah.
Bill Hurlbut from Stanford. It seemed to me watching your film that basically the power of your procedure was in the authority of the computer. And it struck me watching that the computer stood for science in a strange sort of way. Now, in other words, something was telling the individual that something was more true than what they sort of knew by their natural personality. And obviously a lot of beliefs are based on authority, whether they be religious beliefs or scientific beliefs, and they form this cosmology that was spoken of earlier. And what I want to ask you, it's sort of a vague question, but how do you see all this working in the large realm of what was called in the general sense myth? And is it possible, is it just as easy to extinguish what are true beliefs as it is to implant false beliefs? And maybe that's what's going on in transformations of mythic structures within societies.
Well, first on the comment about the authority of the computer, the way we came to that methodologically is the first of these very rich false memory studies that I did involved participating with the relatives of my subject. You know, we'd actually talk to the mother of a subject. We'd get some true memories from the mother. Then the mother would help us make up some details about a false memory that we could plant. We'd go to the subject, an adult saying, we've talked to your mother, and your mother said these things happened to you. We want to see what you can remember. And that was and we found about, you know, a quarter of the time we could plant the false memory of being lost for an extended time and frightened and crying. But it was a tedious method because we had to go out there and find the subject and get the subject's relative, and every single subject was a very time-consuming enterprise. And so we kind of looked for a way that we could have that authority without having to really talk to the parents. And that's how come we came up with this idea of let's get all these data and give them false feedback about their data from the sophisticated computer. And I do think that's part of the power of this technique. You get people to think the thing is plausible, you get them to believe it happened to them, and then you engage them in processes like guided imagination, which I was trying to do with Alan, that puts sensory detail or sensory meat on the bones of this belief system, and pretty soon you got a whole big memory going. And now, I haven't thought much about how it might, work in the difficult problem of these dangerous beliefs that are leading people to do very bad things to other people. It's not that I haven't thought about applications. Some other work that I haven't told you about, we showed that we could make people plant a warm, fuzzy experience with a healthy food, asparagus, and we could get people to want to eat more asparagus. And when that result got publicized, I got contacted by the largest wholesaler of fruits and vegetables in this country. And they said, we got these foods that people really don't want to eat, rhubarb, leeks, and can you help us figure out how to, make people want to eat leeks and rhubarb? And they said they'd supply all the leeks and rhubarb that I might need for this, but what I really needed is some money for a research assistant. You know how that is in the university. But in any event, so I do think there are probably a lot of applications, and I'd like nothing more than to be able to, think about terrorists and their evil behavior that might be based on wrong-headed beliefs and figure out how we might do something with them. But I don't know what that's going to look like yet.
Well, let's see, Rama, and then get back up to Scott up there and see if that deals with his jihadis in any sort of realistic basis. Rama?
Yeah, I have a straightforward empirical question which relates to your last point about fuzzy feelings. And it also relates to the question asked earlier about distinguishing a false belief from a true belief. And I'm wondering, supposing I convince you, I implant a false belief that Roger did something nasty to you 15 years ago, and you start believing this. Now, the question is when Roger approaches you, you start saying, well, yeah, he did something nasty. But what I'd like to know is if I measure your galvanic skin response, would you also emotionally respond to him in a similar manner? In other words, can I uncouple these two so that your false belief is primarily a confabulatory, high level, which one is inclined to think it is, but not your gut level, your limbic system knows better, and you go and shake hands with him and say, hi, Roger.
Well, I can tell you my prediction. Partly, let me just say that we did something similar to that. We made people believe that when they were a kid, they went to Disneyland, and they had a very unpleasant experience with the Pluto character, that Pluto persistently, uncomfortably, and inappropriately licked their ear while they were there as a child. And we found that people then don't want to pay as much for a Pluto souvenir. So that's the consequence, the long-range effect. Now, we didn't measure emotions in this particular work, but my grad student, Cara Laney, who is just finishing her PhD and will be going off to England to teach at Leicester after she finishes, did ask about the emotionality of true versus false memories. There's only one study out there that has looked at that, and that is Rich McNally at Harvard's study and his collaborators with the alien abductees, these people who believe they were abducted by aliens. When they think about their abduction experiences, when they listen to scripts of their own personal abduction experience, they show a whole lot of physiological arousal. They show as much arousal as they might show for other traumatic, seemingly genuine traumatic experiences. They show as much arousal as people who haven't been abducted show for their truly traumatic memories. So that's why I believe that I would get a physiological reaction. And what Cara is doing in her dissertation, what she's done now, because she'll be defending soon, is she's got people who have true upsetting memories And then false upsetting memories, like you witnessed your parents have a physical fight, or you caught your parents having sex. Those are two of her items. And these are self-reported emotions, but she shows, you know, they're just sort of indistinguishable, the emotionality associated with true and false memories. So that leads us to be able to say now that, you know, just because it's detailed, just because it's confident, just because it's delivered with emotion, it doesn't mean it really happened.
So here are two constraints on applying your discoveries to Sam's jihadi problem. First, most jihadis join the jihad through friends, about 70%, about 20% through kin, and almost always now through the internet. There's no gurus out there. There are no recruiters. It's all enlistment. So how do you deal with that? Second, just a theoretical point, core religious beliefs are not false. They lack truth conditions entirely. They are literally senseless, like Aristotle's four-footed idea. And those are entertained in the mind quite differently than false beliefs. So the question is whether those kinds of techniques can both elicit and suppress counterintuitive beliefs without truth conditions.
Yeah, I just don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think a bigger problem is that or maybe another problem that's related to this problem is that we deliver these suggestions. They're very personalized. So it's personalized feedback and a lot of authority, and we are one-on-one with the subjects. And so if you want to influence people on a mass scale, like the producers of leeks and rhubarb would need to, then somehow you have to cull the active ingredient in this methodology and find a way to present it on a mass basis. And so maybe it's some sort of advertising campaign that's going to reach people, but I don't know what it's going to look like.
Would you mind just saying that I actually didn't quite follow the Aristotle thing?
Oh, yes.
I was lost.
So there's a sort of classical philosophical distinction between propositions, which have truth conditions and can be truth or false, and pseudo-propositions, which literally have no meaning, no truth value. And those are usually statements that have the form of propositions, but which violate sort of innate ontological categories. And Aristotle, in the categories, used the idea of four-footed idea. I mean, it's just something we can't even make sense of. And those kinds of ideas are used a lot in metaphors, like woman is wheat. I mean, what does that mean? You just say, it's a figurative expression, now let's give a meaning to it. And many core religious beliefs are very much like that. I mean, there's lots of experiments showing it, that, again, they lack truth conditions, but they're senseless. And because they're senseless, they can be entertained as true. P is true, and then, okay, it's true, now let's find a meaning to it. And that meaning shifts quite phenomenally from person to person, and even from time to time. Let me just give you an example. So if you take a 10 Commandment, here's an experiment we did. Take a 10 Commandment like, thou shalt not bow down before false idols, okay? You give it to a person, you do a Dawkins origami experiment. You give it to a person in a room, and you say, okay, what's the meaning of this? And then you invite someone else into the room, and you say, okay, give them the meaning of this. And then you do this through 10 times. And then you give a list of propositions on the board, including the 10 Commandment, the commandment, the third commandment, thou shalt not bow down before false idols. Nobody recognizes it. Nobody, except autistics. They recognize it quite well, and they also do things like Mao's little red book, Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom. We do this with Chinese. Everybody has a different interpretation. They all think they're understanding the same thing. They're communicating with one another. They're emoting with one another. But no one understands the same proposition except autistics. They get it, you know, let a lot of daisies bloom kind of thing. So they're entertained very differently than just beliefs that we can falsify. And these are the core kinds of beliefs that have to be dealt with. And it's not just a simple matter of expunging them and proving them false.
Sam, and then we'll go to lunch, I think. So say something appetitive.
I'll try. I just thought I should briefly respond to your comment, Scott, which I found to be remarkably eloquent and really amazingly censorious in this context. I mean, it was delivered as though with the eye of omniscience. There's no one in this room who understands religion. No one is evincing the intellectual or moral character necessary to really launch the criticism that many of us are attempting. And I take issue with that, and I can certainly respond to your challenge that I am, for instance, delivering a caricature of Islam. But what I want to point out to you is that how I would not be tempted to respond. I would not be even remotely tempted to say that you should respect my beliefs about Islam, or about terrorism, or about jihadis, or about the demographics of morality in this world. That is a move that is not open to me, and it is perfectly obvious to me that the burden is not upon you to respect my beliefs. You and I disagree, and I will give you reasons for believing what I do, and you will evaluate those reasons. But we've heard from you, and we've heard quite explicitly from other people in this room these disgruntled sounds about how what I view is to be over broken taboos here, that we're not respecting people's beliefs. There's arrogance here. This is not sufficiently respectful of the very heartfelt beliefs of religious people. That is a double standard that we're paying a terrible price for. I would just invite you to reflect. When was the last time anyone in this room was admonished to respect another person's beliefs about physics, or about biology, or about medicine? We don't respect beliefs, we evaluate reasons. And perhaps now is not the moment for it, but I can assure you that I've read the Quran many times. I find it to be a document, and the larger commentarial literature, the hadith around the Quran, I find this to be a literature that makes ready sense of suicidal terrorism. I would never say that the only possible cause of suicidal terrorism is Islam or is religion. I mean, there are other examples of suicidal terrorists who are running different software on their brains, but Islam is a remarkably good piece of software to be running if you want to justify, if you want to get a cult of martyrdom and you want to justify this kind of violence. And we see this every day, and we can talk about who the 19 hijackers were and how much economics or their own backstory of oppression played in their behavior. I would say none at all, and I would say the evidence is on my side. And I've looked at your own studies, and I know the kinds of interviews you do with jihadis, and we can talk about that data. But the larger critique here of religion is that religion is functioning by a double standard. The double standard is you should be respecting people's certainties when they are totally uncoupled to evidence, when they are actually vacuous in the way that you just described, although I take issue with that. I think the claim that Muhammad heard the perfect word of the creator of the universe in his cave from the Archangel Gabriel, and now the Quran is not a vacuous statement. And it's a statement that's literally believed and constrains the thinking of Muslims. So anyway, you're a nice guy, I'm a nice guy, we can talk about this. But the problem of religion is that it really does stop conversation in many other contexts.
That will be the last thing, then we go to lunch, because we actually have no more tape.
Sam, I think you're running your own record. I never said anything about respecting anything. I said understanding it. And let me give you... Yes. But I never said anything about respecting those kinds of beliefs. Let me give you an example. Let me just respond to this one.
Well, but there's only one mic, and it sounds like a very interesting discussion. And we've got. No, I'm going to actually have to tell you that we actually are just about to run out of tape. I really regret that. But we can pick this up in the afternoon session, and we'll be glad to have you exchange comments then.